Tariffs can't replace income taxes, at least not anytime soon. In this video, I'll explain why, and I'll give you some numbers to think about as well. And feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to get your take. The government collects the following taxes. Income taxes are 2.4 trillion, Social Security taxes are 1.7 trillion, corporate taxes are 0.5 trillion, and estate taxes are 0.03 trillion. So of the 5 trillion in revenue that the government collects, 4.3 trillion comes from these taxes. The US is the world's largest importer, importing $3.2 trillion of goods every single year. You would need tariffs in excess of 100% to replace the revenue lost from eliminating the income taxes that I just talked about. But here's the deal. Imports are price elastic, meaning that the more that you tax them via tariffs, the less imports there will ultimately be. So if imports decline as a result of tariffs, then the expected revenue from tariffs won't be raised, which kind of creates this sort of never-ending hamster wheel of raising tariffs and reducing imports and getting less federal revenue. The Tax Foundation actually has a great chart on this, explaining why tariffs are not an efficient way to generate revenue. So in this chart, they use a tariff of 69.9% across the board because that would raise revenue roughly equal to the $2 trillion of the income taxes that the government currently generates from its constituents. But there's always non-compliance, and Tax Foundation estimates that to be about 15%. So the expected revenue from tariffs would drop subsequently. Additionally, they estimate that for every 1% price increase via a tariff, you're gonna see a 1% drop in imports. That's that price elasticity that I was talking about earlier. So while tariffs may sound great in theory, they won't generate nearly enough revenue to replace the income tax. But what about DOGE? Because Elon's goal is to reduce the deficit by at least $1 trillion. And I love this goal because I think there is a ton of government waste in how we spend money. But even if DOGE accomplishes reducing the annual deficit by 1 trillion, we are still going to have a deficit of 800 billion a year. Again, our total tax revenue is roughly 5 trillion and our total spending is roughly 6.8 trillion. So if Elon accomplishes his goal, we will have 5 trillion of total revenue and we'll still be spending $5.8 trillion. And maybe this is where tariff revenue comes in to help us get closer to that break-even number. But as you can see, the math is clearly hard to get rid of income taxes. As of right now, we need income taxes to cover our spending even after we make significant cuts across the board. What about a consumption tax? The US GDP in 2024 was $29 trillion, of which 19.8 trillion was consumer spending. So if you slap a 25% federal sales tax on all goods, then bam, you've just replaced the income tax. Sounds easy, right? But again, we have this issue of price elasticity. Overall consumption and GDP would decline as goods become more expensive to purchase. So not only would federal revenues be reduced as a result of the consumption tax, but our economy would also take a hit because such a large part of our economy is based on consumption. Additionally, a consumption tax is regressive, meaning lower income households will ultimately bear the weight of the taxes. Now, you might not really care about lower income households because it doesn't directly impact your day-to-day life, but you have to remember that a strong society requires balance, and everyone lives in a symbiotic relationship with one another, whether you care to admit it or not. And because a consumption tax would burden lower income households more than anyone else, the wealth gap would become astronomical. And you might not care about the wealth gap because again, it doesn't directly impact your day-to-day life. But the reality is creating two distinct social classes of ultra rich and everyone else is just not good for any country. If you don't believe me, read up on the downfall of Rome and how their wealth gap led to societal issues and ultimately the downfall of Rome. Repealing income taxes is a noble goal, but they're here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future.